Hello and welcome to another episode of I Miss Book Club. I'm Veronica Reynolds from New City Library, and with me as always is my lovely co-host Dana Munch. Good morning, Dana.
Good morning.
So we have a heavy one to tackle today. We set
just a little
up in the process of talking about what is literary fiction. Dana and I realized we really wanted to talk about what is a classic, because they tend to go kind of hand in hand. Obviously, there's modern literary fiction, but the idea of a classic book comes up a lot when we're talking about literature in general, and especially literary fiction. So, Dana, when you were kind of prepping for this, you came across some definitions of what makes a classic. You want to share those with us?
Sure. So I think when people hear the word classic, normally they're thinking of things like Jane Austen, Charles Dickinson, and these sort of 1800s writers. But then you may also come up with ideas of the things you read in high school or like some kind of English class at some point. So there are similarities. There's also differences, but which kind of led me down this path of like, okay, what are the benchmarks for what is considered a classic? They are a little murky, surprising to nobody, but we're going to go through them. So generally, like something that is considered a classic is also considered to be like exemplary or important. You know, it's something that everybody knows. And they are thought to meet a quote unquote high standard of quality, appeal, longevity, and influence. Obviously, the term high standard is subjective, but we're going to go with it. So the first thing is that it has some sort of literary merit or high artistic quality. It's old. Again, another subjective term. Some people use, a benchmark of 100 years since it's been published. There is an argument that that might be a little bit too long. And so they go with quote unquote multiple generations, which again is not much.
I guess what they're trying to prove is that longevity equals classic, which I can understand, right?
Yes. Right. Like something that was popular then is also still popular, like way down the timeline is more the idea of it. And then it has some kind of cultural significance or popularity. It kind of embeds itself into, the society of the time. And maybe it helps shape the culture or shapes different ideas. And then, the appeal factor is that it's accessible to people. It has a wide area of relevance. A lot of people are going to like it. Again, this goes back to the popularity piece of it. So that is kind of the classic definition of a classic. But then there, in looking this up and seeing what the benchmarks were, I also came across this idea of a modern classic. And this is the distinction that is made between, the sort of Victorian era writing versus things that you read in high school.
Which I love. You said this to me before we started recording, and the idea that modern is anything post World War I just blew my mind.
Yes, right. So this idea of modern is sort of outdated in and of itself, but this is when you get, F. Scott Fitzgerald and George Orwell, John Steinbeck, all of those people that you may have studied in college or written an essay on at some point in your educational career, at least for those, actually probably for most
literature
people,
is what I would call it. The stuff you have to
read.
Not you want to read it, is stuff that is assigned onto thee.
Right. And mostly for these books, they get this this label because they have not quite met the longevity piece to be a true classic. There's some argument that they mean, you may need more generations to determine if it holds its weight, 20, 50, 75 years from now. And only then will it be considered a classic. But, obviously those titles or those authors have written books that certainly meet the criteria for the other things, right? Like they definitely have literary merit. They certainly have embedded themselves in our culture and are referred to even in situations where literature is not front and center. So the ideas that were born in these books have sort of seeped their way out, which I think is what, yeah, and that, makes them a classic in their own right.
Sure. So that segues, I think, really interestingly into the concept of the Western canon. So this is a
Oh, joy.
subject I've heard bandied about around. I was minored in English literature in college. I'm sure you have some form of an English degree as well.
I have a science degree.
My goodness. How unusual. We'll have to
Here
pin that for
I am.
another episode. I was a philosophy major, but the Western canon perpetuates through philosophy as well. So the Western canon is a pretty old idea, and it's, when they say Western, they mean Western Hemisphere. Although honestly, what they really mean for the most part is English speaking. A few French and Spanish speaking authors will sneak onto this list. But it is generally primarily a very male, very white list. And it was perhaps most recently formalized, although this was a while ago, in 1994 by a man named Harold Bloom. And so if you've never encountered Harold Bloom before, I would say you probably actually have, because if you ever had to write an essay on literary criticism and you went to a public library, we have a lot of Harold Bloom on the shelves, or we used to. It's not really all that common now that we see those assignments come in, and over time, it's been weeded out pretty significantly. But when I first started working in the library world, we had shelves of Harold Bloom's books. They were literary criticism books. They were held up as kind of like a gold standard of literary criticism. Some of them he edited, some of them he wrote himself. In 1994, he wrote a book called The Western Canon. And in this book, he formalized his idea of what he called the school of resentment, to which he was putting in a bucket pretty much anyone who had some issues with the white Western canon. Including what he was particularly mad about Marxist critical theory, but he did put African American studies, feminist criticism, and post-structuralism as a whole into this bucket of the school of resentment, which is really quite a statement for someone.
Yeah, my face is just scrunched into an eternal cringe about this, especially because you said 1994. That's not that,
No, we're not talking about 100 years
like...
ago. This is, I mean, according to the classics, this is definitely modern, if not post.
Right.
And as a structure for his book, he used 26 authors that he argued were in the Western canon. Of these 26 authors, 4 are women, and 2 of them are Latin American, and the rest are white, European, and/or American men. So why is this an issue? Well, because if you break down the makeup of the world, that's not how it falls out. And Dana Schwartz has a really great podcast of her own. She's also written a bunch of books. She's a really interesting modern literary criticism person. She took on this idea of Harold Bloom. And one of her quotes from this article that she wrote for The Riveter was, "There's a deep-seated cultural bias in favor of male writers, that their stories are important and universal, and women's stories are frivolous or niche." She's obviously just talking about women's stories here, but this covers pretty much every marginalized group. The idea that their stories are niche and only for the people who are already in that group to get something out of. I think what's really important to talk about there is the universality. There is an assumption that a story with a white male protagonist is a universal experience. And when we talk about classics, I think that comes up a lot. Everyone can relate to Catcher in the Rye, but maybe only women can relate to Pride and Prejudice.
Right. It's the idea of it being the default, which is something that comes up even today in terms of media criticisms generally.
Right. So this isn't a new idea. We're not inventing anything here. This has been discussed back and forth for 30 or 40 years. Bloom obviously wanted to have that conversation from his perspective. And, but you wind up with this idea of Western canon, and this impacts all of us because we all go through the American school system to some extent. Well, obviously not everyone listening to this is American, but the people going through the American school system, we are definitely given these American canon books. I mean, we did The Great Gatsby. We did Catcher in the Rye. We did Ernest Hemingway. Yes. And, these kind of standards. So we're reading this stuff as teens and being told that this is classic. This is what we should be held up to. And I will say, in fairness to my school district, we did a lot of diverse reading, but that was all on the New York State curriculum at the time, was my understanding anyway.
Yeah, and I think it puts these titles forward as like this is an important literary benchmark, in the history of writing. And I think it is important to think of who it is that put forth those ideas and how they came to hold that status. You can think about things about how like publishing companies were made of other white men, and educators that were predominantly white men at a certain time were more comfortable teaching books that had been created by other people that look like them. So there's a lot of things that are sort of tied up in here, to the point where you're a kid sitting in class and they're saying, here's F. Scott Fitzgerald and the Gatsby and, all this kind of stuff.
And I think, like, not to pick on Scott Fitzgerald, because he was
we love Fitzgerald.
But, I think when people talk about the great American novel, one of the ones that comes up the most is Great Gatsby, right? Like, that's floats to the top of that list pretty often. And it's supposed to be this big it should be relatable. It should be the American experience, but it's about a really rich white guy.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's more aspirational in that way than like someone that's going to be your next door neighbor or something.
Right. And it's kind of like, I get it, because, obviously it's talking about the time and it's really capturing the energy of the time period. And Gatsby's a very tragic figure and he rose up like it's the American dream. I get it. And I don't even disagree that it's a great novel. Like I think Gatsby is an incredibly powerful book. But does it capture all of the American experience? I mean, I don't think so.
No. Right. Questionable. Like some of those themes can certainly be applied more broadly, but the bulk of the book being like, here's this rich person is a little bit maybe outside the realm of most people's experiences.
And he's a sad rich person. It's important. And then, and so in my questing here, what I found very interesting was there's like, look, you can Google 100 must-read classic books and you will get about 37 lists. They all have, I would say, about some mix of the same 150 books.
Yeah.
But Penguin did one where they polled their audience instead of them choosing the books. And I thought what was really interesting was right off the bat, the first two books are Pride and Prejudice and To Kill a Mockingbird, both female authors. Obviously, To Kill a Mockingbird would be considered a modern classic. I don't think anyone's going to argue that To Kill a Mockingbird's not a classic book.
No, me neither.
And it's number 2. And obviously, Bloom wouldn't even consider that as part of Western canon. And arguably, I find that to be number 1 in books that get assigned and understood and disseminated. Number 4 is 100 Years of Solitude. So we move out of English literature almost immediately as well. And number 6 was The Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a fascinating book because it's fan fiction of Jane Eyre. Do you know about this book? Have you ever heard of it?
No, I actually don't.
That's why I was fascinated that it was so high up on the list, because I haven't read it, but I know of it. It's a feminist and anti-colonial prequel to Jane Eyre, and it's about his first wife, Bertha, the one who's in the attic. It came out in 1966 by Jean Reyes, and I think it's fascinating that this is number 6 on this Penguin list, and I don't think it cracks a top 100 on a lot of these lists.
Yeah,
and it's above Jane Eyre itself, which is really fascinating. There's authors on this list I didn't recognize. I have never heard of I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith.
No, me neither.
So I just found this so interesting. I would love to know which readers weighed in, but The Secret History by Donna Tartt is 11. And that came out in 1992. I mean, talk about modern. And I have read that book, and that did blow my socks off. It is also about rich people being rich. But have you ever read Secret History?
It's been one of those books that has been on my TBR for like ages. Anyone I know who has read it has really liked it and has said similar things about like, it packs a punch kind of feeling about it.
I think that would be a great one, actually, for your chapters if you want to do like a throwback Thursday.
It's long, though, right?
It is long.
Yeah, my
people a little shorter.
Yeah, my people request 400 pages and under.
That's fair. I mean,
maybe we could do a special 2-parter. Might be fun.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, I mean, this list has much more modern. I'm doing quotation marks. You guys can't see me, but I'm quote unquote modern books, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1984 is on here. I don't know. I just thought it was interesting. At number 27, we get Toni Morrison, who obviously is not going to make it into Harold Bloom's canon. But I don't think anyone could argue isn't a mainstay of American classic literature.
Right.
Who hasn't read a Toni Morrison book if they've had to go through any kind of English program. So anyway, it goes on. I don't want to drill through that list too deeply, but I thought it was interesting when you put the vote to the people, how different that
what you actually get. Yeah. And that sort of question about, you know, polling an audience about what's a classic, what you're really asking is like, what book, in your opinion, has been influential or important? And so I think that's really, it's kind of exciting to see that these other types of books or different sorts of authors that wouldn't typically wind up on these lists are on that list, because it's more reflective of what people are actually reading.
Right. And, you know, when you think like, who is Penguin's audience? Because Penguin's obviously a publisher, right? You know, I assume it skews a little younger, probably is a more diverse list. It's readers, obviously. I don't think, you know, they're polling. I don't think they're getting people who are less interested in reading generally, because if you're following Penguin's Twitter, you're probably already kind of self-selecting into this. But I don't know. I just found that really moving, actually, in a way, that there's this tendency towards a more diversity just by opening up the question to a bigger audience.
Yeah, so, and I think it probably also speaks a little bit to, you know, the idea of diversity being more, I'm going to use the word normal, but I guess like it's, these books are all sort of put on the same plane together and considered like equals in the minds of an audience. Do you get where I'm going with it? It's a little bit hard to explain. It's kind of like,
you had actually mentioned, you brought up this really great point when we were kind of doing our pre-gaming discussion, that there's this tendency to group canons away from each other. That maybe there's like the best of the classic African-American books, classic feminist literature. And when we silo these things away, there's a usage for that. I mean, if I want to read great African-American books, I'd love to have a list. That's really helpful. But when things become too siloed, then these classics are allowed to not intermingle with other things and be put on that level playing field.
Definitely. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that these things that would be considered like quote unquote diverse reads are not individualized and are just put into the same pot as everything else in a more even playing field and still come out on top, even when everything is considered all together. And I think that's important and probably reflects the way that readers are reading more, which is exciting to me, that maybe people are just willing to pick up whatever instead of like having these ideas about, you know, who or what makes something great.
I think so. Also, and talking about these section lists, while we're recording this, I don't know when the episode will come out. June may be over, but we're recording it June 1st. So it's the first day of Pride Month. And, you know, when you were talking about, it has to be this old definition as like pre-World War I, how little LGBTQ literature was allowed to thrive at that. Of course. Time.
Yeah.
And cutting out, I mean, obviously the same goes for, you know, African-American literature and everything else. But I think particularly when we talk about LGBTQIA plus voices, they just were simply smothered. I mean, you really couldn't find anything. The first real book that's allowed to come out, they often are coming out anonymously or posthumously. You know, we did the book that became the movie Carol for One Town, One Book a few years ago. And that book actually came out in the late 50s, but it was published anonymously. Highsmith didn't put her name on it until the early 90s because of concerns about the reactionariness of it. And by then she had a career. She'd written all of Talented Mr. Ripley, and she was feeling more confident about having that book with her name on it. Not that she's a paragon of virtue, just to say as an author, but, you know, just as an example. And that was already, we're talking about the 50s, which is 30 years past that cutoff for a classic. And even then it was written anonymously. So I don't know. I think there's all these voices that we wouldn't get to hear. When you think of where civil rights was pre-World War I, which was like in its infancy, post restoration. You're just missing so many voices that I think everyone needs to hear. So that being said,
yeah, I
know. we both came across this essay in different articles being massively quoted. Neither of us have read the whole book, so just if there's something in there objectionable, we haven't read the whole book. But there is a book called Why Read the Classics by Italo Calvino. It was published in 1991, so it predates the Western Canon by Harold Bloom by a few years.
Maybe Harold was mad about this and wrote his
maybe. Maybe he had some objections, because his points, he has about like 14 points of what makes a classic. I don't know if we'll go through every single one of them, but I thought this was like just a really beautiful list, and to me is much closer to what I would love to see a classic defined by. So we thought we'd go over some of these, right? We found this breakdown on a website called The Marginalian. And it's Italo Calvino's 14 criteria for what makes a classic, if you're looking for it yourself. And his first point is, the classics are those books about which you usually hear people saying, I'm rereading, never reading. I mean,
yeah, I love that. Yeah, I mean, this just speaks to the idea that it's something that's popular. Also, there was like something that came up in the definitions of classics are like, classics are these books, according to this definition, that you can read and reread forever and always come away with something new and different, and that it's a book that has a lot to offer. And I think that's kind of what this point is making.
Yeah, and for me, if we're talking about like really like well-defined classic books, I could reread Jane Eyre once a year and find something else in it. Personally, I find Jane Eyre to be one of these fascinating, constantly unfolding books, that I totally understand why it's survived. Oh, sorry. Number 2, the classics are those books which constitute a treasured experience for those who have read and loved them, but they remain just as rich an experience for those who reserve the chance to read them when they are in the best condition to enjoy them. So this
I think this also speaks to this idea of like, often there's a question, which book do you wish you could read for the first time again? Yes. And I think that's what this is kind of saying. And sort of what you were saying about Jane Eyre, something that you can read and love every time you read it. But of course, reading a really great book for the first time is something special that I think all readers love. And there's lots of things that we wish we could go back and Absolutely. Be surprised by the first time.
Yeah, and I think also the second half, like reserving the chance to read them when they're in the best condition to enjoy them. This is what got me started thinking about this whole topic, because when we're talking about literary fiction, it came up that I'm a very bad librarian and don't like a lot of these classic canon authors. And I think it's because of when I read them. I was not ready for those books in those moments. I will be honest, I don't think I ever would have been ready for Catcher in the Rye. Just ain't for me. But I read Dickens. They had us read it. I was 13 because I was in an advanced English class. Mm-hmm. And I honestly hate Dickens, and it's not fair. I've never given him a chance as an adult. I think I'd probably like him if I had come to him first as an adult. But I have so much resentment from...
Yeah. I find this with a lot of different books of like things I've read and maybe did not finish, and it was just not the right time for that book. And I agree, there are things that I was sort of made to read at different points in my life, and I just was not in the best condition to enjoy them. Maybe I was like too scattered with other things, or like at an age where I was being sort of rebellious about being told to read this, enjoy this, and write this essay. I was like, ugh, where's my Spark Notes,
Exactly.
But I certainly think that they are things that I could enjoy now if I was coming to them more honestly.
Yeah, or just in a different part of your life, because I think so many of those books that are a canon, Catcher in the Rye accepted, they're about adults doing adult.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And sometimes you can relate to that, and those books become very beloved to you. But often, I think part of the problem is it's just you're a teenager or maybe an early adulthood, and you just haven't encountered some of these things in your own life yet.
Right. The things that make them long lasting are these overarching themes, which are probably mostly going to apply to adults simply because they've had more world experience with those themes or more, So I agree that when you're young, some of these books may not hit in quite the same way.
So number 3 here. The classics are books which exercise a particular influence, both when they imprint themselves on our imagination as unforgettable and when they hide in the layers of memory disguised as the individual's or collective unconscious. Love this. Very Jungian. Love a collective unconscious.
Yeah. The second half of this, I'm thinking about things like 1984 and ideas about surveillance and how embedded that is, especially in recent times, as being in our collective unconscious, right? Like everyone understands this, not symbolism, but this reference, right, to this book. Even if you haven't read it, I think people are pretty aware of that book, the major themes in that book, how it may relate to anything that's happening, which may not be so much of an unconscious, but
I totally get what you're saying. Like if we were in casual conversation and I said, "Oh, it's real 1984," everyone pretty much would have at least a vague idea of what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
To the point where sometimes it becomes not what the book's point was at all. It becomes just kind of, symbolic of not 1984. I think is usually used pretty accurately, but I think sometimes these things come up. Fahrenheit. I always get the amount of degrees wrong. 451.
451. Yeah.
I think that gets thrown around a lot with people having not read it and maybe not being 100% sure what he was going for. But I think these things come up and I do think they embed themselves. And that is a point for reading these books in high school when you can reach the most amount of people, having a standardized curriculum of books, because it does give people a shared language. When we call something a Romeo and Juliet story, you don't even have to really ever have watched Romeo and Juliet. You know exactly what people are talking about. The whole concept of star-crossed lovers is kind of just there for us to reference. I took the road less traveled, and that has made all the difference. Yeah, I always interpreted that poem as saying, like, I don't know if that difference was good or bad.
This idea just planted in my brain to think about all day.
Oh, no. If the road less traveled by is a good or a bad thing.
Yeah. All right.
I think it's neutral in the poem, to be honest. I think he's kind of leaving it up to interpretation.
Yeah. But as with most great poetry, Right.
But I think we do kind of take it universally as a good thing. Like I've never heard
I definitely agree.
Yeah. I've never heard anyone say I've taken the road less traveled and they mean like, and it was a bad idea.
It ruined my life.
Right. Like we mean it very positively, which is interesting.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to skip 4 because we kind of already discussed the rereading aspect. 5 is a classic is a book that even when we read it for the first time gives the sense of rereading something we have read before. Ooh, right? And I think what that makes me think of is books that just resonate with us so deeply that we kind of feel like we know where it's going already, or we've walked down that road because it's just so a part of us, I suppose.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'm also thinking about linking this back to this longevity idea of a classic is like if you are a reader and you're reading more contemporary things and you read a classic and those same types of themes are coming up, that can speak to either its universal appeal or its relevance or its longevity, this idea that those things stand the test of time, regardless of where you are.
So to tag along with that, I think part of that is sometimes when you've only read modern books or been mostly reading modern books and you go back, the classics can feel kind of tropey, like they're covering very predictable ground. And then you realize, like when you're complaining about it, oh, wait, this is a trope because of this book.
Yes, like this came first.
Right.
This is the original.
Like when you read Jane Austen, you're just like, oh, this is like all of modern, not all of it, but like a lot of modern romance is like built on this house, on this foundation, which is so fascinating. And then we have a classic is a book which has never exhausted all it has to say to its readers. I think that goes back to the rereading point, that it's very rereadable.
Yeah, and also about it having a lot of themes to hit on or a lot of symbolism to uncover. I think it's just saying like it's not something that is simplistic in its storytelling.
I'm going to just go to 8 because this is just, it's a great statement, but how he wrote it is wild. A classic is a work which constantly generates a pulviscular cloud of critical discourse around it, but which always shakes the particles off.
I love this sentence.
Right. Generates a pulviscular cloud. Woo! I don't know what a pulviscular cloud is. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I
just looked it up, and it means, so pulviscular means dusty, resembling fine powder.
What? So it's like that makes sense because it's shaking off the particles from the pulviscular cloud. I love this idea that it's resistant somehow to criticism. Not in a way.
I love this too.
Not that it's like a bulletproof work and shouldn't be looked at critically, but that it can survive being criticized. Because we talk a lot about cancellation, right? Like that's a big topic, and we don't have to go into that. But it's happened forever. You know, having social media has accelerated the process. But there's been books and authors who have been taken down over the years because stuff comes out. In Dana Schwartz's article, she points out, hey, can we not have Norman Mailer be on the Western Canon because he literally stabbed his wife?
Oh God!
Stabbed or killed? I don't remember. Norman Mailer. Look, I don't know the story, and I'm not going to pretend.
I'll just move forward.
Norman Mailer. It's worth a read. And whether you agree with that or not, I think that's happened forever. I don't think that started with Twitter. You know, and I think Norman Mailer
just made it easier.
Dropped off somewhat more recently and being on the canon for that reason, as that story has become more widely circulated. Immunity to criticism doesn't mean you're perfect. It just means that you can survive many waves of culture, which I think is interesting.
And I think this point kind of speaks to like they're hitting a nerve, and the way to hit a nerve is kind of to reflect ideas of a society back to itself, which is going to like upset some people or bring other people in and be something that you can be critical of it, either because you think it's not accurate or it's gotten something wrong. But if the idea is important enough, then it's going to be able to kind of shake the criticism, not because it shouldn't be criticized, but because it's something that should be talked about or considered.
Right, and maybe even the conversation it starts is part of the book, right? Like, To Kill a Mockingbird is a wonderful book. It's not flawless, and it is worth, I think, reading that book just to have the conversation around the book, especially now that we have the follow-up, Go Set a Watchman, which was extremely controversial both in its publications. We could do a whole episode on Go Set a Watchman. But it's an extremely controversial book for a variety of reasons. And rereading To Kill a Mockingbird through that lens, you can have a huge critical discussion about it. It doesn't take down To Kill a Mockingbird. We're never going to stop reading that book, I don't think. But it does set a different lens on it. Nancy and I did a special one-off book club on Go Set a Watchman. And
did you? You know, I've never read it.
It challenges you. It's a challenger. I don't know if it's definitely not going in the canon. It doesn't measure up, I think, as far as writing quality and stuff goes, but it does put Harper Lee in an interesting light. Not a negative one, just it's fascinating. The fact that she probably wrote it first.
More to consider. Yeah,
because Atticus is not great, as it turns out, which I think would be tough for a lot of people, thinking about Gregory Peck. Here's another good line. You ready for this one? This is number 10. A classic is a term given to any book which comes to represent the whole universe, a book on par with ancient talismans.
This is lofty.
This guy is just like hitting him out of the park. Ancient talismans. Pulsivular cloud.
I mean, I guess the first thing I'm thinking about is like there are some of these books and titles that everyone has heard of, you know, even if they are not a reader, and even if they don't really know what it is about, they might have like some inkling of an idea, but even though they just know the title or know the author hundreds of years after it was written is like incredible, you know?
So let me put this to you, because I actually have done an entire lecture on this. It's available on our YouTube channel, New City Library on YouTube, on Richard III, the play. All right. Most people who have any familiarity with Shakespeare believe the historical Richard III to be a bad dude who definitely killed a lot of people. The thing is that we have no historical record of what exactly happened. We don't know who killed the princes in the tower. And Shakespeare was very much writing propaganda for Queen Elizabeth. She was his patron. And her family had been on the other side of that war. Now, does that mean that Richard III was a great guy? Probably not. I wasn't there. I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But think about this. This guy wrote a piece of propaganda so good that 500 years later, we still believe that's the truth, like as a culture.
Yeah, I'm a little mind blown about this.
Right? Because so to the point where there's a society, there's a Richard III society who are trying to clear the name of Richard III now.
I have like a full-on gasping face right now.
If you heard recently that they found the skeleton of Richard III, that was the Richard III Society. They were like not alone. I mean, they had like a lot of professional help, but they raised a lot of the money to help find his body because they were hoping to even prove that he wasn't a hunchback. Unfortunately, they were wrong. He was, but yeah.
What a detail.
Can you imagine this guy? Richard III's been dead for 700 years.
We're still talking about him.
We're still talking about him because Shakespeare wrote about him. Like, talk about an ancient talisman. This guy is still getting tarred and feathered for something he may or may not have done.
Oh, no, this makes me feel bad for him.
If anyone's curious about this, I really recommend A Daughter in Time by Josephine Tey, which is a fictional book. But it is, first of all, it's really splendid writing. Josephine Tey is a great writer. But she wrote this book. It was one in a series about this detective she had, but the conceit was that the detective was laid up in the hospital, so he couldn't like go out and detect stuff, right? So his love interest brings him a book on Richard III, and he keeps looking at this picture and he goes, "This guy looks like an accountant. I don't think he killed anybody." So he just does from his like hospital bed all this research on Richard III, and it's extremely charming because he's trying to detect his way to prove that Richard III's innocent, which you can't do in either direction. But it's a really good summary of the case for Richard, done in an extremely charming way. So I'd recommend that. That's a classic to me, which brings me to number 11. Your classic, yours is in quotations, is a book that you cannot remain indifferent and which helps you define yourself in relation or even in opposition to it.
Do you want to talk about Catcher in the Rye?
I think this is James Joyce for me. I define myself in opposition of James Joyce. No, that's not fair. But yeah, Catcher in the Rye is a really good example for me personally. I mean, to bang on about it. I totally understand why other people like it. This is not like a referendum on why it should be thrown away. In fact, I think it proves this point. I just, reading it at the same age as the protagonist was, deeply disliked him and did define myself in opposition to him. So it is a classic for me in many ways because my dislike of that book became a hallmark of how I felt about literature in general. It did define a lot of things for me personally. So yeah, maybe it is a classic.
Yeah. So sort of related to Catcher in the Rye is a book that I would consider a personal classic for me, which is Perks of Being a Wallflower, which is often considered to be like similar to Catcher in the Rye in the way that you have like these teenagers coming of age. But this book, like I read it at the same time, at the same age as the characters were in it. And I just like latched on for dear life. And I don't typically reread books. I think I have read this book like 5 times. I mean, it is a shorter book. It's written in like letters, so it's easier to get through.
I love an epistolatory.
Oh, me too. But this probably started that, right? Yeah. But I read it like a bunch of times as a teenager, and then I read it once again when I was in my 20s, and like it did not hit the same at all. But it had like such a nostalgic feeling for me about having read this book at the place I was in at that age, and like what the characters are going through, and whatever the feeling was that I like connected with. So to me, that is something that I would consider. Obviously, it's more modern. I think it was published
1999. I think I just looked this
1999. Yes,
for a different reason. I'm gonna blow your mind again today because I don't think you know this. Perks of Being the Wallflower is the only book that was challenged in our local school district in the years that I've been
really
at the library. And yeah, it was challenged. It was assigned in a high school classroom. And it was challenged by a parent who didn't want their kid to read it, and we couldn't buy enough copies. As soon as it was challenged,
I feel like this is typically what happens with challenge books.
We had to buy like 15 copies.
That's so interesting, and I'm so happy to know that. I mean, I am not from the area, and so, and obviously this happened pre my working there, but
not by a lot, by the way. I think maybe.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Years. Yeah.
But it kind of makes me happy, like that more people wanted to read it. You know, I don't know what I could say about its literary merit necessarily, but I can totally understand why it would be challenged by a parent. Obviously, I think that's for a parent to decide for their own family, but regardless of that, I love this idea that you had to buy more copies.
We couldn't keep it on the shelf. We'd always had, just to be clear, we'd always had a lot of copies of it because this was still in the days where there was assigned summer reading, where you had like a list that you had to read off of. For those of you who don't know, a lot of school districts have moved away from that and now tell kids just like read anything, please, which is fine by me. But there used to be these standardized lists that you had to read off of, and Perks of Being a Wallflower had always been on that list. So we always had a lot of copies because the summer reading books used to go out like gangbusters. So this wasn't like we were like splurging wildly for fun. It was just the holds list became so long that it was unsustainable. So we did have to buy more copies. You can ask Mary about it because obviously it was a teen book. But yeah, maybe part of being a classic is getting challenged because 1984 certainly has been.
Well, this sort of goes back to that other one we talked about the pulviscular cloud of critical discourse, right?
Like, I have to work that into everyday conversation just to confuse people. I feel like that is a pulviscular cloud.
It is excellent, but right, like, so it has been criticized, you know, if it was challenged here, it certainly has been challenged elsewhere. I'm pretty sure this shows up on the ALA list of like most frequently challenged books and all that too. Yeah. And yet it endures, right?
They even made a movie of it.
Yeah, they did.
Which happened more recently, I believe. So let's skip to number 14 because we've been talking for a while.
Yeah, sure.
A classic is a work which persists as background noise, even when a present that is totally incompatible with it holds sway. So this makes me think of Shakespeare, right? Where we're all kind of peripherally aware. But Shakespeare, too, how many movies came out in the 90s that were modern retellings of Shakespeare?
Yeah, right.
So many.
Yeah. I mean, one of the first things I thought about this was sort of goes back to what you were saying earlier about Romeo and Juliet. Everyone knows what this means, but also like this idea of star-crossed lovers is in like so many romance stories, and we all just kind of know like, oh, this is a Romeo and Juliet thing. Or,
you know, in that line, Much Ado About Nothing, where we have the sniping enemies to lovers, right? Like they're very funny and they're like kind of fighting with words the whole time and it resolves. That's every rom-com ever made.
Yeah.
They have
like a lot of these have become like romance tropes.
Right. You know, and I think that's just, I don't know what to make of it, but it's certainly interesting. This is Calvino's kind of, it was a witty answer to the nitpicky reader, according to the article. It's circling back to one of these points, but your classic is a book to which you cannot remain indifferent. I can't think of a better final definition than that. It's just books that make you feel things. The worst thing I think a book can do is make you feel nothing. Boredom is worse than negativity. Because let's face it, I may have not liked Catcher in the Rye, but I'm still talking about it, and I haven't read it in 20 years. At least.
Yeah, right? I know.
You know, and there's way more books that I've read and forgotten about entirely.
I agree. Like, if a book fails to make you feel anything, that's not a book for you, you know, and it also has like failed you as a reader in a way, but that's not to say it's going to fail everybody. You know, obviously we talked about every book its reader. I agree with you. Like boredom is worse, is the worst possible outcome in reading. Even something like being enraged would be a better experience, in my opinion.
You've managed to get away this entire time without saying it. So I'm going to ask you, Dana, I'm putting you on the spot. What's your favorite classic book?
Oh gosh. Well, here's the thing. I have not read many classic books, which maybe makes me a bad librarian.
No, I hate them and you haven't read them.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've read some of them, right? Like, I read Wuthering Heights in high school. I read Pride and Prejudice when I was older, like, out of school. I just wanted to, like, there was a time where I thought maybe I was going to read more of the classics. And the reason for that is because I think the classics are sometimes used as a benchmark for people being well-read. And they come with this,
talking about us being bad librarians for not having read this, which is asinine. Obviously, that's not true.
Yes, and that's what I'm getting to. And it's like, for me, books are for enjoyment. And I personally find that the classics come with a lot of obstacles, meaning, you know, like the language can be difficult. Some of the symbolism goes over my head because I don't really understand the time period. There's like other references to things I don't really understand. For some people, that is going to make it more enjoyable because you have more content to like dig into. But I find it less enjoyable, at least at that period of time in my life. There have been things that I've read. And like, even when I read Pride and Prejudice, I did really like it, but I was sort of like, okay, like, let's move on to something else now. And I just kind of never went back. I've read more of the modern classics, as we talked about, but these, you know, the predominant classics, I really haven't read a lot of them.
I think that's fair, you know, and it's funny because you say that, like, for some people, it gives more edification, because I'll tell you what I have read a lot of because of the way I did my studies in undergrad is like what I would call like ultra classics, because I've read Chaucer, and I've read Beowulf. Ultra classics. I love that stuff. And I think I love it because it is still understandable. You know, Beowulf is an adventure story, you know, and Chaucer, I mean, he's so funny because he was just writing about humans humaning. Like, Canterbury Tales is just peopling all over the place. And it feels like when I meet those characters, they feel to me as real as somebody I met yesterday, because he really just had a good grip on what humanity was like. And yeah, there's a lot of context that you need. Obviously, I was reading these in a college classroom, so I had a lot of help from a professor who was contextualizing. I was reading modern translations and comparing it to the Middle English. But it's funny that you say that, because I actually like those more than I think that I like the Victorian and the Georgian era books that maybe kind of are more where people go to when they think Western canon. And I have no idea why. I think because I like delving into this deeper, older history where you have to like be almost like a literary archaeologist. I don't know why it captures me so much, but there you have it.
Just to give myself another tally, I have also read Beowulf. I need every point I can get here.
And if anyone's like, I could never read Beowulf, what I highly, highly recommend, because it came from oral tradition, don't read it on the page. Listen to Seamus Heaney's modern translation, which he reads himself and is on YouTube, I believe, at this point.
I love this recommendation.
Seamus Heaney is a wonderful modern poet. He did an excellent modern translation of it, and he has a wonderful voice when he reads his own work in meter. And it just gives you a better sense of how people would have been hearing it. Because again, when we lose context, oral tradition is oral tradition. It's not meant to be read on a page. And I bang on about this constantly when I do Shakespeare talks, because people are saying, well, how do I be a better reader of Shakespeare? I'm like, don't read it, go see it, because reading it is dead. It's a dead feeling. Like, you can get a lot out of reading Shakespeare. I'm not saying that I do. I go back and read the plays sometimes, but it's a performance. It's meant to be performed. And so much can be done with even a halfway decent set of actors performing it. And hearing something recited to you, even Chaucer was meant to be read aloud in a pub. You know, you'd have one or two literate people in your neighborhood and they would read it to everyone else. So that's a completely different direction, but maybe it's talking about more about how you can appreciate classics sometimes if they're presented in the form they were intended to be enjoyed in. I think
that's an excellent point.
Yeah, making people read Shakespeare, I don't know that you really get it. I mean, in fairness, like, all my teachers had us read it aloud and showed us productions and everything. And that's what you need. And that's probably why I love Shakespeare, because it was taught to me properly. You know, if you're just sitting there dryly reading Henry VI, you're going to take a nap. You know, eventually. I think we've exhausted everything we were going to talk about.
I think we've exhausted. I think we agree. The classics are, you know, what you want them to be, kind of.
Yeah. Don't let Harold Bloom boss you around. You read what you want to
No. Read what you enjoy. Don't worry so much about it.
And speaking of classics, what are you reading next month? For what are we going to discuss next time?
We're doing Hamnet next. So Hamnet is next in two Tuesdays from now. Okay. So not this one coming up, but the one after.
Which I think really dovetails with this conversation nicely, because it's a reinterpretation of Shakespeare's life with Shakespeare barely in it, is my understanding, or not in it.
Yes, exactly. It's more about like, what happens to his family, as told from the perspective of his wife.
I look forward to that discussion, because I have done a lot of research on Shakespeare's life for the last lecture I just gave, so I have a lot of thoughts.
I'm going to have to bring my A game.
No, it's okay. You bring your A game about the book, I'll bring my A game about Shakespeare, and we can make them work together.
I could do that. Perfect.
But for now, we'll say goodbye. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a wonderful day.